Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about different health topics. As we are not medical experts, we ask for you to check with your doctor first before using any of the information provided in this podcast. Furthermore, we talk about third-party views in this podcast. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting their views, and we apologize in advance if we do so. Thanks.
Today, guys, we are going to be talking about EQ, emotional intelligence, and how we can improve it.
Okay.
So, just like in the conference video, you asked, why should I listen to Paul DeMott on this topic? And I'd say that the same reason applies. Like, this is something I've really worked on and really analyzed, and I hope that what I've learned can help you guys. So, one reason why I really am interested in EQ is because there's two things that have been researched and shown to cause happiness. So, if you look at the happiest people in the world, two qualities about them is that they're very autonomous and they have very good social relationships.
Okay.
And so when we study happiness, the field of positive psychology studies happiness, we often see that these two things are most correlated to happiness. So having good relationships and feeling autonomy, which is basically you have autonomy, for those who don't know that word, is basically your power over your own actions.
Okay. Because I think a lot of people associate autonomy with just doing things on your own, but you're saying
having
control of your own
having
actions.
control of your own actions and being able to do stuff yourself.
Right.
And so like when we look at EQ, there's two main elements to emotional intelligence. The first element is sort of one's ability to control their own emotions in situations around other people.
Okay.
And you could say that even independently, when you're by yourself, being able to control your emotions is a part of EQ.
Yeah, right.
So personal control over emotions is a big part, and then controlling the emotions, or at least causing good emotions in other people, is the other element to EQ. So the two things when you hear EQ that you should think of are one, control of your own emotions, and two, control over how other people respond to you.
Okay, so I think a lot of people kind of don't believe in or don't buy into control your own emotions. Like, can you control yourself to be happy or be less stressful or something? It just seems kind of cheesy, I guess. Like, what? Like, is there some legitimacy to this?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. And I think that there's good arguments on both sides of the debate. But to me, my personal reason for believing that we can control our emotions is because I've done it. I've experienced it myself. There's times when I've been very angry at someone, and by looking at the whole situation through a different perspective, I've been able to get rid of that anger.
Okay.
And one of the examples I always point to when someone asks this questions is the book A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. And basically he was in a concentration camp, Auschwitz concentration camp. And as we all know, like at the concentration camp, the Jews were humiliated. They were treated like animals, not as human beings and stuff.
Right.
And they didn't feel like human beings because they weren't treated like them. And so he had the realization when he was at Auschwitz that ultimately he either allowed or disallowed what they said to affect him negatively.
Okay.
So he could control his emotions and how he responded to their derogatoriness towards him.
Huh. Okay.
And so we look at the most extreme example, and he was able to find some bit of happiness and some sense of emotional control in Auschwitz concentration camp. So to me, that's a strong example. And from my personal experience, Auschwitz, I make the inference that we do have that capability to control our emotions. So why don't I just throw another example out there?
Yeah.
So, one way we control our emotions is through the beliefs in our head. So you take someone who reads a book, a white supremacist book, let's say.
Okay.
And he becomes incredibly racist as a result of reading this book.
Okay.
So now whenever he sees someone of a different race, he feels anger towards them.
Oh, it's an associated anger.
An associated anger towards.
Yeah.
So what we see
like
is
the
that
Pavlov
he had cognitively changed his belief system, and as a result, his emotions changed when he saw someone of a different race. So let's say then that he gets a lot of counter examples that all this white supremacist stuff isn't true. Okay. Well, then he can change his emotional response to them as a result of changing the belief in his head about the situation.
Okay, so you're saying that if there's something that constantly angers us, it may be our way of thinking about it or reacting to it that matters a lot. So I think one thing that is important to mention in this too as well is, yes, you can get rid of anger by doing certain techniques, but at the same time, I think anger serves a purpose, right? Like if anger wasn't like good in some perspective, you probably wouldn't have it from evolutionary means. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So it's true. Like most of our emotions are just natural evolutionary qualities that we have.
Yeah.
But I believe our ability to control our emotions is a skill set. So over time, doing something like meditation, where you sit and observe your breathing, you suddenly start gaining more control over your different emotions, and we see an objective change in the brain in those areas that are responsible for emotions.
Right.
So what we see is that we can take action and do things that do affect those areas of our brains that are related to emotions, and then create positive change as a result.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to point out, just to help people kind of, I guess, relate to this scenario and why this is so incredibly useful, is if you think about what I like to think about is the alien viewing us from space. So if you if you think about how an argument goes versus a regular discussion, if you were just viewing this from space, you would see two people just talking or moving their mouths and uttering like sounds to each other. And in one scenario, someone is like going into hyperventilating shock or something like that. In the other scenario, the other person's like smiling, like interested, intrigued in the discussion. And what amazes me is that it's just words alone and the emotions communicated through those words that trigger you to go into a certain type of emotional state.
Yeah. And why is that? So like emotions are linked to communication. So every word that we have in our vocabulary has an assigned emotional value to it.
Yeah.
So when we start talking to ourselves and we say stuff like, I hate Bob. Bob, I just can't stand Bob. Like all these words have emotional connections that then trigger are those feelings in our body. So
if
based
like
on
the boss or
and this is
something
where
like that.
and this is where cognitive therapy plays a big role in emotional intelligence. So cognitive therapy is working on how we talk to ourselves in our head.
Yeah.
And the theory behind it is that because these words have emotional connections to them, if we change the words that we end up saying to ourselves and verbalizing, then we will feel entirely different and we can feel happier. So instead of saying I hate Bob, you say to yourself like, I think what Bob did was wrong, but from understanding his perspective and understanding his situation, I think that I can see why he made that decision. And so you notice that the words that I use have a lot less negative emotional context to them.
Right, but I mean, like, I think for a practical everyday use, it's kind of hard, right? Because sometimes, like, let's just get a real example going. So you have, maybe you're working at a company, maybe
So
you're
let
a
me just
business.
get this straight. You're arguing that emotional intelligence can't be improved?
No. I'm saying it can be improved, but I think just to hit it home, let's get a good example.
Okay, great, yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean that.
No, that's awesome. Okay.
So let's say like you have a boss, and you work for a business firm, and several times or maybe let's say you work for a hedge fund, and you've emphasized to the boss several reasons why stock A should not be invested into, and stock B clearly is going to work out much better. And despite all this, advice, the boss still goes with stock A, and your whole company tanks because of it. Now, you'd be furious at the guy, and let's say this happens again and again and again. I guess my question is how would you use your emotional intelligence to not become like angered every time you see him?
Okay, yeah. So first, this brings up a great example because I can actually explain a lot of elements through this. So firstly, when you look at anger serves a purpose in the sense that it's used to punish people in the social perceptions sphere. So when we talk and when we say stuff about other people, there's sort of this metaphysical sphere in which all this stuff affects other people's perceptions of a person. So let's say I go behind Bob's back and I talk really bad about him. Although nothing physically exists,
nothing physically happens.
There's these words that are stored in people's memories. And basically, I am essentially punishing Bob for his actions and using this as a means to control him, and also I may be using it to feel a sense of superiority myself.
Okay.
But we can, by gossiping and talking about other people behind their back, we are actually punishing their actions, which serves a purpose because when they start getting this feedback that other people don't like them acting this way either, then they stop doing it.
Okay.
And so what we see there is that it has a purpose. So what does anger serves the same purpose. When we get angry at someone, the natural response to anger is to want to stop, prevent the anger and do whatever necessary to prevent this person from being angry at you. Because when this person's angry at you, it could be very detrimental to your social standing.
Right.
Because they go around and they're going to tell other people about how you screwed them over and all this different stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where anger serves a purpose.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting about anger, though? Sorry.
No, I was going to say, but in this case, though, I think we're saying that anger ultimately hurts you in the end, right?
That's what I was going to get to, yeah. So anger can serve the purpose in preventing your boss from making a similar decision. But ultimately, when you're angry, you're really just punishing yourself. Because all of these emotions you feel, you are the only ones that feel. You are the only one that feels them for the most part.
Yeah.
So you are releasing cortisol, stress into your bloodstream, all this different stuff, and you are experiencing it. I think Buddha had a quote that getting angry is basically cutting yourself, or something like that, and then hoping the other person dies by cutting yourself or something like that.
Okay.
And so that's what anger is. It's kind of like you're hurting yourself in hopes that it somehow hurts the other person, which in most cases doesn't. So an emotionally intelligent person in this place probably would have talked to their boss first off and said, look, you are making bad decisions, and you're not following my advice, and it's been costly to you before, and I'm not going to work for you if you continue doing this because you're hurting a lot of people's lives. They are probably going to be more direct with the person and express their feelings to them more directly because that's a trait of an emotional intelligent person. And I want to get to that, that trait. But but if they are getting angry and it's ultimately hurting them more, this is where self-control, autonomy comes into the emotional intelligence area. So how they end up thinking about this anger will play a big role in how bad they actually feel inside. So if like I said, they think of it, they are empathetic towards their boss, even though they're angry at him. then they will talk to themselves and say like, the boss is kind of a dumb guy. He was raised by dumb people. Like, he didn't follow my advice for this and this reason. Maybe, it's not my fault. I didn't screw up. I shouldn't like torture myself over this. And so notice how like the cognition between an emotionally intelligent person is much different than someone who's not emotionally intelligent. Someone who's not emotionally intelligent in this situation gets very angry. And like I said, being angry is just like cutting yourself, hoping the other person dies.
So
like,
so you're saying like the attitude maybe to take is like when you get into disagreements with another person, which usually leads to anger and arguments. The best thing to do is first confront the person and express why you disagree with them. And if that doesn't work, or things don't change, then you just let the person go.
Yeah,
you just don't interact with that person.
Yeah, so I don't want to get too much into that because that's sort of for another area of this podcast.
Okay.
But basically, emotional intelligence is a skill set. It's being able to look at a situation and say, this is how I should respond in the situation,
Gotcha.
and this is an ideal strategy.
Gotcha.
So what I was going to say is emotional intelligence is a skill set. It's saying, based on this situation, there's different strategies to use to get the results that we want. And an emotionally intelligent person is going to choose the more ideal strategy more frequently than the unemotionally intelligent person. So there's different strategies we can use to get people to do what we want. The emotionally intelligent person makes better decisions, and that's where their intelligence is derived from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, I think a lot of people though just kind of focus on intellectual intelligence. They say to themselves, "Well, like IQ matters a lot more than EQ because I need a job and like support my family and stuff." Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. How does IQ and EQ relate to job, and what is that?
Okay, so in this day and age, first off, the IQ test isn't really taken that seriously. It tends to be taken seriously in sort of a cultural way in the United States. Like people still talk about like, oh, this person must have a high IQ and stuff. But in this like more scholarly field, the IQ test really doesn't have that much significance anymore because the best correlation that it has is like a 0.14 correlation to like SAT score.
Oh, wow.
And that's like a pretty bad correlation. It's not even, that's a weak correlation. It suggests that maybe there's no correlation at all.
Yeah, guys, just so you know, like the R squared value for a correlation in statistics, usually you would want like a 0.99 or a 0.90 at least.
To say it's actually a correlation.
A 0.14 is virtually nothing. Yeah.
And so basically all the studies they've done between IQ and success show like no correlation between having a high IQ and being successful.
Yeah.
I think that they've actually seen somewhat of a negative correlation because actually people with high IQs tend to lack EQ skills.
Yeah.
And one of the major ways in which that occurs is through arrogance. Because they're smarter than everyone else, they put off this like judgmental vibe. They can't work well with people. They don't break stuff up and like give other people responsibilities. They just don't work well with people. And in business, wherever you're going to work, it's about working well with people. And the people who generally make more money are like C students who have high EQs.
Yeah. So let's kind of like maybe break this down because arrogance is a sign of negative or lower EQ. So I think one thing to really sit down and investigate is IQ is important. You obviously need to process and be able to perform certain tasks. But at some point, maybe at 100 or something like that, I don't know exactly where, the IQ needed to perform most job tasks just simply is found throughout most human beings. It's not very high. And at that point, everyone can do the job asked of them to do, but rather it's their emotional intelligence that gets them into the job interview.
Yeah, well, what I say is that people with average IQs are not limited until they reach like further depths of human study.
Yeah.
So if they're in a really advanced field, they might be limited in what they're able to discover.
And we're talking like PhD of like atomic physics type of material.
Yeah. And so like I just don't put much credit or value into IQ anymore because EQ has demonstrated correlations between success.
Yeah.
And EQ has demonstrated correlations between happiness. And so to me, but most importantly, EQ is something that can be developed and built. Most people develop EQ over a lifetime. Like you'll see someone who's like in their 40s who has incredible EQ, and they've built this EQ up over like 20, 30 years of experience. So it takes time to build, but it's buildable, and it's not. It's more plastic than say your IQ is, which arguably cannot change.
Yeah, when we say plastic, that means it's more flexible in terms of the fact that you can do something to improve it.
Yeah.
So let's say
what I was going to say is I think one thing that's important to look at when you're talking about EQ and IQ is understanding that we have two different regions in our brain that's responsible for each one of those.
Okay.
And we've talked about this in the Skill Up podcast where we discussed how when you repeat an action over and over again, you develop a neural pathway.
Right. Yeah.
So people who oftentimes the geek, the high school geek, the nerdy guy, has a low EQ. not because he doesn't have like an emotional side to his brain that works well with people, but because both the logical and emotional side there's a part of the brain that connects them together. And being able to switch in between these is really hard. So if you spend a lot of your time doing activities that require the logical part of your brain, then you're likely not to develop a good switch that switches it back. And without the repetition to build that neural pathway, then the emotional side of your brain won't be very developed. So basically, if you're going to work on like computer programming all day long and then go out and try to be social, it's going to take a long time to switch that area of your brain.
Right.
So the geek has a hard time being social just because he hasn't yet developed that part of his brain that like switches between the two elements.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to comment on too, I think I might have mentioned this earlier, is women tend to actually have a higher EQ than men, while men tend to have a little bit higher IQ than women. And the reason for this is that in women, their brain has a larger corpus callosum, which is kind of the part that bridges both hemispheres together, which facilitates or allows better communication between those parts. You can integrate more systems in your brain together. And a lot of people ask, like, well, what is in place? If women have this larger structure, then men must have something instead. What do men have? And you just find it's an enlarged area for sexual drive. So whatever that you can make that out to be, maybe that's why men are more like focused, hyper-focused on like becoming the best chess master or something. But anyways, so that's an important difference, and I think that's why like moms, that kind of explains why moms have the traits that we like as a culture assimilate them, like the caregiver. When the girl or guy is crying, they go to their mom.
Yeah, they're able to tune into the emotional side of their brain more efficiently.
Yeah.
Mainly because they don't transfer, or maybe they transfer more often.
Yeah, they transfer, or they can integrate more things, and that's also the reason why they think women can multitask more. And there's a theory actually that emotional intelligence is multitasking. Like you're focusing on multiple details, like body language, word linguistics, how the person presents their tone of voice, and other aspects like that. So.
Yeah. So patience.
Yeah.
Now I want to get into the stuff that you guys actually want to hear, and that's I will stop talking about emotional intelligence and what it is and whether you can change it or not, because we've determined what it is and that you can change it. So let's get into how you change it.
Yeah.
So my personal theory from like really studying this stuff is that there's two main things that prevent EQ in
Development.
the development of EQ. So like you have two people. One is like a geek and another is like the jock or whatever.
Right.
And let's say they both like spent the same amount of time socializing.
Really? Okay.
Let's just say,
okay.
for example, now that's pretty uncommon. They probably haven't, but let's just say that they have.
I would say the jock is probably.
So why is it sometimes though that like one person maybe develops a higher EQ even though they both have the same experience, the same amount of time? And so that's what I want to talk about. So there's two elements that I think prevent EQ.
Okay.
And one is egotism, and the other is anxiety.
Okay.
And you can argue that anxiety is somewhat linked to egotism, although I think that anxiety is more of a genetic component because different people have evolved different levels of anxiety to survive in their environment. So although egotism, you can say that someone is anxious because they're overly concerned about other people's perceptions of them and overly fixated on themselves, and you can link that anxiety to egotism, but I don't think it's always that case.
Yeah.
Okay, so so what is egotism? So we talked about like what the ego was in a previous podcast. It's basically a logical mechanism to evaluate our social standings and stuff, and when you like compare people by saying like I'm better than Joe because of this and that. So egotism in a social situation, where it like really catches us up, is that people who are egotistical, and I'm not saying people who like have a disorder. I'm just saying most people have enlarged egos, and it prevents them from developing EQ. So the problem when you have when egotism is a problem for you, you become overly fixated on your own actions, people's responses to everything that you do, and how people are relating to you, and you don't spend enough time understanding other people, what they're thinking, what's going on with them. So
let's get an example going.
Let me do an example. So I for a brief time would play poker tournaments online.
Okay.
And I like got really into it. Like I have all these weird things I've gone into, but basically one thing you realize about poker is that no matter what, like everybody's getting like good hands every once in a while, bad hands. There's some element to luck, but there's these people that regardless of their hands they're getting, they're winning poker. Winning poker is a skill set, okay?
Yeah.
So it's not that like so and so is winning just because they got lucky hands. It's because they're doing something. And so what you realize like when you start playing like higher level poker and stuff is that when you start out playing poker, you're like really fixated on what you hold in your own hand.
Huh.
So you flip over two queens and you're like, yes, I'm going to go all in and win this.
Right.
Well, that's your evaluation. That's the only measure at which you evaluate the situation is what 2 cards you are given.
Yeah.
The difference between the player who's really good and that player is that the really good player is evaluating a multitude more of things. He is evaluating like 10 other things.
Yeah.
And most of those are social patterns.
Huh.
So he's paying more attention to the habits and betting habits of his opponents and how
Yeah.
they are playing the game, and he doesn't really care what he has in his hand,
Let me
because
just
what he
comment-
has in
yeah.
his hand is not that important.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to comment on this.
Yeah.
Just from a science perspective, the brain tends to look for the most simplest system. So in other words, it's much easier to look at just your hand and do all these math calculations on just the 5 variable cards in your hand.
Yeah, and
versus,
then whatever flips in the river.
yeah, depending on like the 25 other card options that somebody else could have. So your strategy might be like, oh well, I just look at my hand. And that's usually when like whatever cards are open on, and I just go from there. But in reality, you probably are thinking like that because you're lazy and you're not capable enough to like incorporate all these.
And you will
views.
learn, like, I mean, you can win from playing like that,
Right.
and get positive reinforcement to keep doing it, but there's people who will beat you every time regardless of what hands they have, just
Right.
because they're evaluating position on way more factors.
And I shouldn't say you're lazy. I
No,
should say
it is laziness to some extent. Like,
But I'm not
ultimately,
saying
we
it's-
want to conserve brain power, so it's not
Yeah.
necessarily lazy, but it's just that we have a mechanism that to control.
Yeah, it's not exactly conserving brain power.
Yeah,
it's
it's
more
not,
like
yeah.
conserving. You're trying to guarantee yourself that your brain can make sense of the situation, and the less amount of variables there are, the higher probability that your brain will figure out some pattern behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So the more variables you have, the more you fear that you won't get any valuable pattern recognition from it.
Yeah.
That applies not just to this card game, obviously, but to like different.
Yeah, so let
situations.
me pull this back and talk about how this analogy fits into emotional intelligence. So I was talking about egotism is sort of a roadblock to high EQ.
Yeah.
And it's because just like the poker player who's only looking at 2 cards, you're just looking at how you're coming off, how
Right.
people perceive you, and you're not paying attention to the emotions of other people.
Right.
So this is a giant roadblock because emotional intelligence ultimately comes down to being able to see emotions in other people and then know how to respond to them.
Yeah.
So as you can see, that's why egotism is bad, is because we're not evaluating a social situation with all the information. We're just limiting ourselves to one thing.
One view. Yeah.
And ultimately, if you are egotistical, you want to stop doing this because you're going to have much better results. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about social strategy.
Just one comment really quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Paul said. With IQ activities, you are hyper focused on achieving one goal. So, for example, you might be trying to solve one math problem or one equation at one point in time. But the difference with EQ that we're saying is that you have to consider multiple variables, multiple things at the same time, and that's a completely different skill.
And that's where like being able to use different parts of your brain is
very,
advantageous.
Is very useful. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Sorry.
Okay. So basically, what I'm saying is that to develop EQ, we have to start becoming aware of all the variables that are out there, and we can actually, interestingly, use the logical side of our brain to develop our EQ. So like the big thing is, I think that someone who has high EQ, the superpower that they have is like being able to be empathetic towards other people.
Yeah.
So if you've never heard of this term before, there's something called mirrored neurons.
Yes.
Mirrored neurons. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're talking to someone and the other person smiles, I don't know if you know the scientific.
Yeah.
But you actually smile as a result of these mirror neurons.
Yeah, so let me
if you could
kind
explain-
of break this down. So mirror neurons they actually recently discovered in the last decade, and the whole purpose of them is literally to put you in the other person's shoes. That's exactly what they do.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone smiles, the only way you know that smiling means happiness is because your body is simulating a smile itself and says, "Oh, actually, when I smile, I feel happiness."
Yeah.
So because that person is smiling, I feel their happiness. This is the reason why people are sports fans, because when
Yeah,
the
I was
guy
gonna say.
hits a home run, they feel through their mirror neurons that they are the actual ones hitting a home run.
Yeah.
And they get an adrenaline rush from it. And that's why people are fans for anything.
Yeah, and that's why people like when their team wins, they're like, "We won," and it's
Yeah.
like, "You didn't win.
You didn't
weren't
do,
even
you just
playing.
scared at a screen.
Just
Yeah,
watch the
exactly.
screen."
So, and this is like a really big deal. Mirror neurons are not just in sports, obviously. It's what you use them when you look up to like your heroes. You want to be like, I want to be like that guy. There's a lot of people like in the science community, like we might see a surgeon perform like a surgery or something, and we're like, one day like I want to be that guy. Like
Yeah.
I could just see it right now. So mirror neurons are extremely important, and they allow you to empathize with the other person as well.
Yeah. And so like the core to my theory is that someone who has a really high IQ has developed this ability to empathize well, and so like I was saying before, just to tie it back into the whole egotism thing, is that like, if you're not looking at the variables, then you're not allowing your mirror neurons to work. If you're not like everyone possesses these mirror neurons, some more than others, because they've developed it more.
Yeah,
They've
they've
developed these
exercised
neural
them.
pathways more, and they've exercised them. But if you're like, totally fixated on yourself and your self-image, then you won't be looking at other people's eyes and being able to pick up the emotions that they're feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, So
can I? Sorry, just before I know you want to talk about anxiety really quick. That was the other.
Oh yeah.
field.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me just comment one thing on the science behind it because I wanted to transition to that. Is that
Yeah.
that's cool?
Let me just ask: are you gonna put
Yeah.
like mirror neurons into it and stuff? Because that-
Yeah. Actually,
Yeah.
I wanted to. So we talked about mirror neurons, and there's no exact one place where mirror neurons are located because your body uses different parts of your brain to imitate what you're seeing and what you're feeling and everything that's going on. But at the same time, there's also different locations of anxiety, but the main one is the amygdala. And that's kind of like near your brainstem. The brainstem, sorry, don't want to get too sciencey, but your brainstem is like your primal instincts, like breathing, heart rate. So amygdala is like primal as
And
well.
current theories suggest that the reason that why some people experience more anxiety than others is because the amygdala
I would
is
say.
actually overactive.
Yeah, and
for
you
the
can
next-
actually
for purposes.
train your amygdala to become overactive. You see that with a lot of people who invest in the stock market. Their amygdala is like amazingly well, which is kind of a bad thing for them because
Yeah.
it inhibits them from doing anything because they're so worried about everything.
Yeah.
When like you're intoxicated, your amygdala's functions greatly decrease. That's why you're less inhibited to do crazy stuff. So, sorry, I want to transition that too.
Yeah, and so that brings a good point. So I talked about egotism being a problem, and anxiety is also a problem. And the main reason deals with mirror neurons. Okay, so when we feel anxiety, we often have an increase in cortisol in our bloodstream. Our throat tenses up often, and that makes it hard to talk. Our muscles are all tense,
Yeah.
and it's a very I wouldn't call it a painful feeling, but it's a very discomforting feeling. It's
Yeah.
very uncomfortable. Okay.
You feel like you have more energy than you need to perform the actual task.
Right. And so if you're communicating with another person and you're anxious and you experience anxiety, then their mirror neurons pick up your anxiety and cause them to also feel anxiety.
Yeah.
And luckily, a lot of people with high EQ have realized that anxiety, oftentimes when they mirror back anxiety, it's because the other person is shy and nervous. But
Yeah.
evolutionary speaking, we could think that maybe interpret this anxiety as like a threat, as a danger. They're afraid of
Yeah.
something that's about to happen. And so the general cause of this is that because of mirror neurons and the fact that our anxiety is portrayed back on other people, people don't feel comfortable around us.
Yeah.
And making people feel discomforting is a big element, is the opposite of EQ, because people with high EQ can make people feel comfortable.
Yeah. Sorry,
so-
one more science segue. I promise it'll be the last one. Okay, so when you are anxious, you activate what we call the sympathetic nervous system. So like when you're like relaxed, eating potato chips on the couch, you have a parasympathetic. So like your gut's moving and you're just kind of not very active. But when you have like what we call a fight or flight response, a sympathetic anxiety, like, oh my gosh, this girl's beautiful and she's standing right in front of me, your body triggers like an adrenaline rush, your pupils dilate to let more light, so you can like visualize the target better, your reflexes improve, your muscles are ready to go. But like what Paul was saying is that the difference between you attacking somebody and you being anxious about something is literally the same response in a human being. It's the same sympathetic nervous response. And so while you might be anxious in a social situation, someone could easily interpret the same signs as like aggressiveness or distancing yourself because you're fearful of them, ready to
Yeah.
attack and stuff like that.
Plus, because they're also experiencing the feelings that you're portraying, but probably not to the same extent, it's an uncomfortable feeling, and people avoid uncomfortable feelings. I talked a little bit about this, but I believe that operant conditioning is one of the most overlooked areas of psychology,
Can
but
we-
one of the most important. Yeah, I'll explain.
Sorry.
So operant conditioning is that we seek out pleasure but avoid pain. But we avoid pain much more than we seek out pleasure. And so when we're in a social situation and someone else is casting this anxiety feeling upon us, we try to avoid them
As much as
as much as possible. So someone with a high EQ is able to project positive emotions onto another person, and as a result, the person links this person to that positive emotion, and so then whenever we see that person, we like them.
Yeah.
And that's what liking is a linking of positive emotions to that person.
Yeah, so maybe just to reiterate to drive this home. Basically what we're saying is when you are anxious or you're nervous or you have a negative emotion that you don't like experiencing, through the other person's mirror neurons, they will experience the same thing. And because it's a painful emotion and people tend to avoid pain, they tend to avoid you.
Yeah.
So the
So
whole
that's
point.
a low EQ person.
So yeah, so the whole
Yeah.
point is if you are anxious or nervous, you're only giving yourself a disadvantage before you even
Yeah.
talk to the person.
And a high EQ person is doing the opposite. They're not making the person feel uncomfortable, but they're making the person feel comfortable.
Because they themselves are relaxed and comfortable.
They themselves are relaxed and comfortable, and they often emit value and positive emotions towards that person. So they tell a funny joke, and they both share laughter.
Yeah.
Now that laughter is linked to that person.
And I think just as a general tip, this is so easy, but just smiling itself.
Yeah.
Even if like you don't have to do the full smile, even if you like kind of like grin a little bit. I just find from personal experience when someone is like there's like the constant grinners, I guess. Those people I love. I mean, I just tend to socially like talk to more because I just have this warm feeling with them
Yeah.
from my mirror neurons, like grinning a little bit inside as well. I mean, I don't want to like. I mean, I'm not trying to be like a smile cyst or something like that, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying, when you generally smile, it first of all it does make you happier. Research has shown that. But second of all, it makes the other person that you're talking to happier, which means they want to talk to you more.
Yeah. So kind of like what he's saying, like how can we take all this and relate it back to like actionable, like next actions that we can actually do to improve our EQ?
Yeah.
So the first thing that is really important is to stop one-dimensional thinking, being fixated on yourself, and start observing what is around you.
Okay.
And so another like a big reason why people are fixated on themselves, and one of the reasons why introverts tend to have lower EQ when they're younger, is because they are like off in their head thinking about these deep problems and they're not present to the moment. So
Right.
being present is important because it allows you to evaluate more variables. You
Yeah.
are seeing what's going on and you're seeing how someone's, so like when someone is giving you a look of I am so tired of you talking, you catch it. But when
Yeah.
you're just fixated on how you're saying and just those variables only, you don't catch it, and
Yeah.
this person's getting driven out of their mind.
Another thing I want to
Yeah.
say is that on the same theme is maintaining a reputation beyond what it's worth. So what I mean by that is, when I was younger, for example, I wanted to be like super smart, and I'd like try to like talk to my friends about theoretical physics, and I'd be like, dude, like black holes, like they're so cool, like we don't know much about them, but they like hold every galaxy together. And like I would get into these debates with people about like the future of time travel through black holes or whatever.
Yeah.
And the point was is that I tried to maintain a reputation of like I know this stuff. I'm really smart. I know more about this area than any of you do combined.
Yeah.
And the minute someone started to question that reputation, I was like insta defend. Like I was trying to defend my reputation, but it was defending.
And notice too what happens a lot of times when this is the case is when we're trying to defend something and we have a emotional attachment to being able to defend it because we have to validate our perception of the world. Notice that as soon as he goes into this defensive mode, the other person's going to start feeling that too.
Yeah.
And like uncomfortable as a result.
Right. The whole point was not to prove myself that I knew this stuff, but I wanted everyone to agree that I knew this stuff more than they did. That was
Yeah.
like my main goal. And I mean, that ultimately hurt me significantly in terms of emotional intelligence because even if I did prove all of that, what does it add up to?
It just has a social value in the sphere of like the metaphysical sphere of perception.
Right. But I think the amount of emotional damage I did in the process,
Yeah.
it was nothing.
And friends that you pushed away. And
Yeah,
stuff.
it was
People
nothing compared to like the amount of the reputation I could have gotten. I'll give you another one example. Like
Yeah.
I remember I was in like I think it was like 8th grade or something. We all came back. I was like a nerdy guy. Still am kind of. But anyways, so I'm in 8th grade like, and I remember we come back from the summer and like these like the popular girls come up to me and they're like, "Hey Nick, like did you hear about that 10th planet that they discovered? Like planet Xenon or whatever." I don't know, they made up a name. I was like, "No, I have." I mean, I'm thinking like, "No, that I haven't." But like, I have to maintain my reputation of being smart. So I'm like, "Oh yeah. I mean, they've been looking at it for a while. They use a couple like different telescopes. But I think the Hubble discovered it first." And they just like burst out laughing as they made up the entire thing. And I was just like felt entirely embarrassed. But like that's how introverted narrow viewed I was, just
Yeah.
trying to prove to other people that I was like, smarter. Yeah.
And that is like the perfect segue into what we're going to talk about next. So
Okay.
I mentioned empathy. Someone with high EQ is able to empathize with people. So what does that mean? It's being able to feel for them. And why? So then, why do people like being felt for? Is
Yeah.
the question. And so what Nick said is a perfect example of it. So we create this whole reality in our head of how we want to be perceived by the world.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we defend it with defense mechanisms. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts. But like when we've created this world for ourselves, and someone tries to tell us that this world is wrong, we resort to defense mechanisms such as like denial, by saying I don't have a problem with that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a great person. Like, like rationalization. Like, oh, they're only saying that because they're jealous of me.
Right.
That sort of thing. And so ultimately, we develop this perception of ourselves that we want the world to see us as.
Yeah.
And part of it is, I think in some sense, because as human beings, we seek control over our environment. So we want to be able to control our perception to other people.
Yeah. Right.
And so we develop this whole persona of person that we want to be seen as. So someone with high EQ like recognizes it like that.
Yeah.
Okay? And so like when
yeah.
Nick was saying, I don't interrupt.
No.
But wait, just like when you were saying that you wanted to be perceived as smart. Well, someone with EQ can detect that like that, and then he is going to play towards that and see you in that way. So why don't you?
Sorry. Yeah. So one thing I was just gonna say was, I think a common theme that runs throughout emotionally intelligent people is that they don't try to prove any type of trait about them to another person. So in other words, they don't try to prove that they are like the smartest or the most athletic or the most business savvy type of guy. They don't gain anything from that.
So let me talk about why they choose not to do that. And I would argue, like, counter argument is that they do it, they're just more subtle about it and more effective. So I talked before about how, like, there's different strategies to get what we want from people and stuff. And someone with high EQ often develops good strategies because they've done so many and they've failed so many times that they know it works. So
yeah.
you'd have someone who in their 40s, like has incredible EQ, but like when they were like 15, like they're bragging to their friends about how great they were at everything.
Yeah.
But because they've developed these experiences and realized that bragging is counterintuitive, not counterintuitive, but counterproductive to their social thing, they've developed this strategy of not doing that and implying their value in more subtle ways.
Yeah, and I think actually when your primary goal or primary intention is not to prove that you are particularly good in some area, you end up actually doing it inevitably.
Yeah. Well, bragging, actually bragging would be a great thing to break down, but I kind of want to do it in a different podcast. It's complicated and stuff. But ultimately, bragging is like a very direct way to communicate the way that you want to be perceived to other people.
Yeah.
But other people will like put up blocks to it, and they don't like it because, for one, it's not an objective thing. But it's very complicated, and I want to do another podcast maybe on bragging and maybe social skills that need to be developed. But pulling this back to like empathy, I talked about how the EQ guy like that knows that Nick wants to be perceived as smart. So that's what empathy is. It's that ability to recognize how the other person feels and then play to it, like to be able to recognize it. So I have a theory that a lot of nerds are gonna really like. Okay.
The Paul theory.
And they're gonna like it because it has a lot of hope to it.
Okay.
So I theorize that the reason why nerds often go on to become very successful is because they got something in high school that few other people got. That the jocks didn't get, that the
A's?
social people. It's not A's, okay? It's not A's. But there's some people who got it like anyway. Maybe they got it through childhood, but they had a painful experience during high school. And I think that this is one of the best experiences to have. But anything could be this. Like maybe your parents died when you're young. But pain is one of the greatest ways that we develop empathy.
Really?
So in order to relate and understand someone else, the best way and means of doing that is to have experienced it ourselves. And then when we've personally experienced it, we can see it in another person. So like for me, when I see someone who has like social anxiety, he gets called on in class and like, his throat constricts and he can't speak, I feel very empathetic towards that because I know what that's like. When I see, like a kid who's, gets rejected by a girl over and over, I like am empathetic towards that. But I'm also empathetic
because you know what that's like.
Because I know what that's like. And so like, bad experiences are catalysts for developing EQ because they give us this ability to recognize things in other people and then be able to discuss it with them and really appreciate them. And like empathy is at the core of high EQ. And so the other thing that happens is not only like it's important to have your own experiences that are similar to other people's to understand them, but it's a skill set to be able to do this. So just you can feel empathy towards someone without experiencing the same thing that they have. But just so like if let's say my parents died when I was young or something, and it caused these emotions for me to feel. Like, but let's say someone else, their dog just died.
Right.
I can relate to them and feel empathetic towards them because, even though mine was a greater pain probably, I still felt pain, and pain is relatively universal.
Yeah, it's
physical
the same
and mental pain. It's the same emotions that through the body. So we can use our bad experiences to relate to people who, and just the same we can do with positive experiences, like when we feel great. And so that is why. But why empathy is so important is because we build this world around us, and we want this world to be confirmed by other people, and we want people to see us this way.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that makes us feel better than being seen that way, as we want to be seen.
Right.
So I can talk a little bit about like how you start to do that, because it's something that I'm working on. And like I said, I'm not like all that great at this stuff. It's more that I just have spent a lot of brain power trying to understand it, and I'm hoping that over time, as I get more experience, I get better at it.
Okay, just in the interest of time, do you want to do that on a second podcast?
Yeah, why don't we do
I
emotional
think we're running out of
intelligence part
time
2?
right now.
But we really appreciate you guys listening to this.
Definitely.
And check out our emotional intelligence part 2.
Okay, thanks guys.